2021 virtual conference, and welcome to those who are just joining. I'm Caleb Silver, the editor-in-chief of Investopedia and the vice president of SABEW, and we're delighted to have you all here. We want to thank all of our sponsors for partnering with us for the spring conference. We've brought together the top newsmakers, policymakers, top business leaders, and some of the top business journalists in the world to share great stories about the recovery in 2020, things that are happening right now, skill sessions. So we're delighted to have you here. We particularly like to thank the Associated Press, the sponsor for this session. As we know, the pandemic upended the hospitality industry as conferences were canceled, travel was halted, and events and vacations were all postponed. The hotel industry felt that freeze acutely as it faced a near complete stop of its operations around the world. As restrictions continue to lift, though, and economies start to recover, that industry, and particularly Marriott International, is right in the middle of it. We're delighted to welcome Marriott's CEO, Tony Capuano, as our newsmaker interview to SABEW. He took over as CEO for the company in February after the passing of longtime Marriott CEO Arne Sorensen. On behalf of SABEW, we'd like to extend our sympathies to the Marriott family. Arne was always generous with his time with SABEW, and we will remember him well. Tony will be interviewed by MSNBC's Velshi, the host of Velshi, Saturday and Sunday mornings, and a longtime business journalist and also a friend to SABEW. He's also pretty well traveled, which makes him the perfect fit to host this conversation. Take it away, Ali.
All right, Caleb, thank you. And I am pleased to be here, and thanks to SABEW for inviting Tony and me to be here. Let me introduce Tony to you. Tony Capuano is the CEO of Marriott International. He took over in February. As Caleb said, we were all saddened by the loss of Arne, and it's always tough to take over for someone in the midst of things, but it was also tough because Tony, you've taken over Marriott at a moment in which things are changing, things are in flux. You've had to have been adaptable. I've been watching this from a front row seat because I've been traveling for the last year because of the news, and in most cases staying, I think 98% of the hotels I've stayed in are Marriott hotels, unless there literally isn't one around. So I've watched the evolution and the differences and the changes and the adaptability that we've seen, but it's a real treat to sort of figure out from your side what that looks like and where you are. So first of all, welcome. And second of all, tell me the stuff that you've talked about a lot in the last few days, because you've had your earnings report, you've had your board meetings. Tell me about the trends that we might find intuitive, but that you're actually seeing and having to work through.
Well, thank you. And thanks for having me. And let me just say thanks for the invitation. From Marriott's perspective, I can't stress enough how important the work of this group is. Helping us understand an increasingly complex global environment, trying to navigate the 133 countries where we do business. And to state the obvious, thanks for your relentless pursuit of the truth. Increasingly, it feels like the truth is a little hard to find sometimes. And so the work that SABEW does is more important than ever. And it's a real thrill for me to be here today.
Thanks for that.
As you mentioned, we had our first quarter earnings call yesterday, and I think largely the way I would characterize our remarks was guardedly optimistic. When you look around the world, you almost have to go market by market, country by country, but we see some really encouraging signs. I think maybe most notably, what we see is those markets that can lean on deep pools of domestic demand are the ones that are recovering most rapidly. So maybe not surprisingly, we've seen the most rapid recovery in Greater China. We reported on our earnings call that for our system, which is about 400 hotels, we're actually back to pre-pandemic demand levels. The thing that was most interesting to me when I scrubbed through the data, in March, not shockingly, leisure demand was well ahead of where we were in March of 19. But business transient demand was actually 5% ahead of where we were back in 19. So largely Greater China's back to pre-pandemic levels. Go ahead, please.
I just wanted to ask you, is that a indication of China being better off than a lot of countries, or is it the idea that if you're looking for aggregate domestic demand, there's just more of it in China than in other countries because of its size?
Yeah, I think it's both. I think in some ways it's a little like inventory management, FIFO, right? The pandemic really unfolded in China first. So they had a head start on beginning recovery and containment and vaccine distribution. But to your point, they also have a rapidly growing middle class, a middle class that had just started to travel internationally, and they got that travel bug. And when the borders closed, they started to explore their home country. And I think that's what's led to the pace of recovery we've seen across China. Similarly, in the US, that was our second strongest market. In March, we got to just about 50% occupancy. I never thought I'd be in this chair celebrating 50% occupancy, but when you're recovering from the low teens, it feels pretty good. And again, the US is a market with a deep supply of domestic demand. You contrast that with Europe, where the European markets are still in the teens in occupancy, and it's because they rely so heavily on inbound international travel. And I think they'll have a much slower recovery curve.
And obviously the Europe stuff, we've been hearing from the airlines in the last few days that there's some hunger and appetite from Americans to travel to Europe, but because of the uncertainty of being able to book and reopen, a number of those leisure dollars that people like myself might have planned for Europe in the summer are being redirected to domestic travel this summer. And at some juncture, if we haven't figured out Europe in the next, I don't know when, you tell me, that month or so, you're going to see a bit of a wash on the outside travel that was going to Europe.
Perhaps, although interestingly, I know many of your members covered the EU Commission's statement that they plan to open European borders to vaccinated US travelers. Even without a shred of detail on when that would happen, what documentation or testing would be required, one of the great things about our business is we can track consumers in real time. We saw unprecedented spikes in call volume and Marriott.com on all European destinations. Yeah. And similarly, when Greece came out first and started to give some clarity on when and how, we saw bookings go through the roof for our hotels across Greece.
I'm one of them. For France, I'm one of them. The minute I heard it, I booked. And I'm ready to go. Are you different than the airlines though? Because the airlines have actual physical plant issues that they've got to deal with in terms of planning for the next 3 or 4 months. Your hotels are there.
They're there, although interestingly, at the very bottom of the impact of the pandemic, we've got about 7,600 hotels around the world. We had more than 2,000 closed.
Wow.
Today, we've only got, as of last night, we had 366 hotels closed, but 25% of our hotels in Europe are still currently closed.
Are there any of those that will not reopen?
Probably a few, not a disproportionate share though. There will be some that the economic impact to our owners have just made them untenable, and maybe we'll end up with a new owner that'll reopen at some point. Right. And so to your point, we have the buildings, some of them are closed and there's a startup period. And the other challenge is labor. And that's a challenge we're having even here in the US.
Tony, I'm going to be staying at one of your properties in San Francisco on Thursday. And every time, a couple of days before I check in, I always get a note from the hotel. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's from a concierge, sometimes it's an automated generated note, but it basically warns me about what's not happening the way you might
expect.
What to expect. It's a very helpful thing. It's different in different places, and some of those things will change when as restrictions lift and things get better. What's changed permanently in your business? What's the thing or a couple of things that has happened during COVID that you will now implement permanently?
Based on what I hear from our operators and our guests, I think it's probably 2 main categories. Number one, it's really interesting to me. We had all of this wonderful technology to simplify the travel experience for our guests. Pre-pandemic, the take rate was shockingly low. So the ability to check in mobily, to get a mobile key on your phone, when you got to the hotel to use a chat function through the Bonvoy app to request extra towels or a late checkout or something else. And sort of single-digit adoption pre-pandemic. Post-pandemic or during the pandemic, we've seen rapid adoption of that technology. And I think our guests have really embraced it in a way that they will continue to use that technology even when the pandemic has receded. It's a little like my parents. My parents, I don't think, had ever ordered from Amazon in their lives. Now they're addicted to it, and they'll continue that long after the pandemic. The other thing that I'm confident will continue, one of the things we've all learned, while it might not be perfect, you can work from almost anywhere with the adoption of technology like this. It used to be, and you know this from traveling in our hotels, you could sit in the lobby and you could play a game and point at the guests and say, she's a business traveler, he's a leisure traveler, and that group with name tags are group meeting attendees. I don't think it'll be as easy going forward. I think we've started to see this real blending of trip purposes.
Interesting.
Where folks say, instead of letting my family travel without me, I'm going to go with them on this leisure trip. I may disappear for 3 hours a day to do Zoom calls. And so what is that customer? Is it a leisure customer? Is it a business customer? It's really blended. And that will continue well beyond the pandemic.
And in fact, I have traveled for a year without my wife, and starting this week, it'll be the first trip that we take together. It's actually a work trip for both of us, but we'll be in the same hotel and we'll be sharing, some time together. So that's an interesting point. Your business is still mostly business. It's sort of 70-30 split traditionally is what it was. What is it now? Because you mentioned, and I've heard from others, that leisure's coming back obviously faster than business, although I imagine that when business comes back, it'll come back big.
Yeah. In the first quarter, it was almost inverted. So it was close to 70% leisure, as you might expect, disproportionately in the US drive to leisure. But we think it's going to come back, and we think there's going to be two big drivers two catalysts for the return of business travel. Number one, the continued distribution of vaccines. Before we opened up the line, you and I were talking about this. I got my second shot Friday, and it leads you to feel a bit invincible. And I think business travelers, once they get vaccinated, they're anxious to get on the road, to see their business partners, to see their customers. I think the other thing that will really be a strong catalyst for the return of business travel is the reopening of offices. I'm sitting in my home office today. I did our earnings call from our headquarters yesterday. It was certainly not scientific, but I saw more cars at our headquarters building yesterday than I think I've seen since the start of the pandemic. And as more and more of those businesses get back to the office, I think you'll see them getting on the road.
I never really thought that I didn't know anything about what was going to happen in this pandemic, but I didn't really understand the vaccine and mask thing as being political. How do you deal with that in your industry, whether it comes to guests and properties or employees? Rules around masks, around vaccinations, about who gets vaccinations, about letting people in based on tests or vaccines?
At the very start of the pandemic, I think we made a very wise decision, which was not to pretend that we, a bunch of hotel operators, knew much about the virus. And so we assembled a cleanliness council of epidemiologists, cleaning experts, food safety experts, and we've really let their perspective guide our operating decisions. So as we operate today, in every one of our 7,600 hotels around the world, all of our associates are masked. We require masks for our guests. We require social distancing. We've got heightened cleaning protocols, and we'll keep that in place until our Cleanliness Council gives us different direction. And it does create some challenges. You think about the sort of disparity between growing up in the hospitality industry, where your reflex is to say, it would be my pleasure, to any guest request. And then you have a guest come in a jurisdiction where masks are not required. And suddenly we ask our associates to take a very different role, almost of an enforcement officer. The good news is the vast majority of our guests applaud us taking those actions, because they don't want to be put in that position of having to ask a fellow guest to put on a mask.
Tony, I want to ask you about another trend. One thing I've noticed, I travel a lot, so I'm a control freak. I book everything discreetly. The car, the flight is booked in two segments, so it's not a return trip. The hotel's booked separately. You have been getting into the all-inclusive game, and I noticed that when I go to the airline websites. I noticed that when I go to Marriott. This idea that particularly as you're gaining in leisure travelers, that there's something to be said for this whole package idea. You got into a partnership with Sunwing in 2019. Obviously, most of this that I'm seeing is in the Caribbean and Mexico. Can you tell me a bit about this and this trend and how you're thinking about it?
Of course. And I've always said in many ways, the development of our growth strategies is simple. We've got 150 million plus loyal Bonvoy loyalty members, and we listen to their requests. And long before the pandemic started, we kept hearing more and more interest in all-inclusive vacations. In my prior role, I ran our global development organization for about 13 years. And because of our size and scale and the breadth of our brand portfolio, we didn't win every deal, but it was rare we didn't at least get to step up to the plate and take a swing. And we saw dozens and dozens of spectacular resorts being built all through the Caribbean and Latin America. And we rarely got invited to pitch because we didn't have an all-inclusive platform. And so we got into all-inclusive. It was a mixture of new build projects. We did a bit of M&A. We bought a small all-inclusive company in Barbados. And then as the pandemic unfolded and we saw this appetite for leisure travel, and we saw this notion that people wanted a self-contained bubble, it made us look quite bright that we had started the work in all-inclusive. Obviously, we had no expectation the pandemic would unfold, but increasingly we hear the desire from our customers for simplicity, to make one booking. It may include airfare, it includes food and beverage, it includes leisure activities, it includes excursions. And I think there's a broad portion of the leisure traveler that wants that simplicity. And I think ultimately you'll see us grow well beyond the Caribbean and Latin America. There are Asian markets that are starting to see some activity with all-inclusive. There are some Eastern European resort markets where all-inclusive is big. So I think it'll end up being a global platform for us.
Is that you mentioned its simplicity. Is it driven by logistics, people wanting it easy, or is there a value proposition inherent in bundling?
It's both. I think they love the idea of a single price. They don't have to put together an Excel spreadsheet to budget their vacation. They know it's exactly this much. It's billed on a per person basis. Increasingly at the high end of the all-inclusive market, you don't get nickeled and dimed with add-ons. And it's really simple from a budgeting perspective for our leisure travelers.
So there's only two things I don't like about Marriott. One predates the merger with Starwood, but the soap at Westin, that little leaf, I it's weird. The other thing is that when you did the acquisition, when you did the merger with Starwood had a ton of brands, and I'd lost track of what they all are. And Marriott had a ton of brands, and I'd lost track of what they all are. And now you have all of them. So I don't know. I don't even know. 30 plus brands, something like that.
30 brands.
Yeah. What's we have a question from the audience. I want to mix those in with my conversation. I think it's from Amy, who said, post-COVID, what's the future of brand segmentation at Marriott, but in the industry more broadly as well? I'm confused. When there were 5 brands, I could understand where everybody fits. When there's 30, it's like, do people with a W in their name who are under 5 foot tall like this one? I don't get it.
Well, we get a version of this question quite often. And it sounds something like, do you have too many brands? Are you going to divest yourself or consolidate certain brands? What's the perfect number of brands? We love the breadth of our portfolio, and we love the choice that offers, not only to our customers, but to our owners and franchisees. I think most folks know this, but we really are not in the hotel ownership business. We have 7,600 hotels. We own 20, and I'd be happy to sell you any of those 20. And so as a result, you've got many multi-unit partners of ours that want to continue to grow their portfolio within our system. And the breadth of that brand portfolio gives them choice as well. However, the big caveat to that, and your question and the audience question underscores this, it's only great to have a portfolio that broad if we do a good job providing you with a very distinct positioning for each of those 30 brands. And I would give us an incomplete in that regard. There are certainly brands in the portfolio where the positioning and the consumer promise is crystal clear. If you're going to a Ritz-Carlton, you know what to expect, you know what the experience should be, you know what it's going to cost, and I don't think there's much confusion. On the other hand, if I say to you, well, you can stay in a Le Méridien or a Renaissance, there's probably less clarity. So we've got more work to do.
That's a great answer, because when you can deliver, I mean, I stay at Westin's a lot.
Right.
And they all, I can't even tell you which Westin I was at the last 5 times because the experience is so consistent, and I mean that in a good way. I want another question that we've got from one of our members in the audience here, which is one that's sort of bouncing around a lot these days, especially since we've looked at the employment numbers. Can you talk about the labor challenges? How difficult is it to fill openings? Is the $300 federal supplemental UI benefit keeping people from returning to work, and wage pressures?
We've seen challenges in the markets where we've seen the most rapid recovery. So South Florida, Arizona, Texas. I looked at some numbers yesterday. We've got about 8,000 open positions across those 3 markets as we sit here today. I think it's simple to say it's because of the extension of the unemployment benefits. I think that's one of many factors that's contributed to this challenge. I think you've got the extension of employment benefits. I think you've got a handful of retailers who have thrived through the pandemic. Amazon being a good example, Walmart being a good example, where they are competing for that same hourly talent. I think the status of public schools, whether they're going to be in person or they're going to continue virtual or hybrid. You throw all of that in the blender, and unfortunately, you've got folks that say, I want to get back to work, but I've got to take care of my family. And if I've got uncertainty about school, maybe I'm better served in the short term taking unemployment benefits, being able to care for my children in a virtual educational environment. And I think the other challenge we've had, forever, folks have thought about the hospitality and the travel and tourism industry as a fairly safe harbor. I think their faith in the stability of that industry has been rattled by the last 15 months. It's been a real shock to them that we could go from mid-70s occupancy to single-digit occupancy on a global basis in the blink of an eye.
What about wages themselves as a separate discussion by virtue of the fact that it's a little bit politicized? There's been a real effort to increase minimum wages. In some cases, the market demands that it happens. In some cases, political. In some cases, there have been referendums. The president tried to get a minimum wage increase. And frankly, there were a couple of Republicans who came back and said, let's talk about a $10 an hour minimum wage, which indicates that there's room for movement. What's your position on wages, irrespective of what you need in order to fill your spots?
We've been pretty consistent and pretty vocal. We believe there should be an adjustment to the minimum wage. We think it should be a federal decision. We think it should be phased in. I mean, you look at the percentage of total job loss in this country that's been in travel and tourism. You don't want to double down on the challenges to this industry by putting in a $15 minimum wage overnight tomorrow nationally. There should be a phase-in period. There should be some reasonable adjustments. And for hospitality, I think you've at least got to consider how you treat tipped employees. But we absolutely think that the Fed should entertain and push through a modification to the federal minimum wage.
Are you having trouble filling positions right now?
Just in those markets where we've seen such a rapid rise in demand.
So like everybody else in those markets.
Exactly. But, you know, we're using all the tools in our toolbox. We're having job fairs. We're offering one-time incentives. We're doing everything we can. And in some instances, we're actually having to cap occupancy. You know, what we don't want to do to you, you're headed to San Francisco. I don't want to be able to staff the hotel for a 70% house and then get greedy and fill it to 100%.
Right.
And have your experience suffer as a result.
Now, this is an issue that hotel owners always have with hotel companies, right? When there is lower occupancy, they sometimes complain that there is pressure from the brand to lower rates in order to attract higher customers. And some owners say, we can't pay our bills at those rates. It doesn't cover the cost of the room. How has that gone in the last year?
Well, that conversation has really evolved. And the way I would characterize that conversation today, there is a natural tension between what I would call the short memory of guests and the long memory of owners. And what I mean by that, maybe I'll just, if I have a second, I'll tell you a funny story. I get a few hundred guest emails a day. And I received one from one of our guests, and he said, I understand how challenging the pandemic has been to the hotel business. I've got a lot of empathy for some of the changes you've had to make, but please bring back daily housekeeping. He said, at home, my wife gives me one towel a week to use. And the thing I love about traveling is I use every towel in my guest room every day. It's my version of going to the spa. And so as folks get vaccinated, as they get back on the road, again, their memory is short. They say, I want daily housekeeping. I want the restaurants open normal hours at full capacity. I want the spa to be open all day. On the other hand, you have the owners who've borne a disproportionate impact financially of this pandemic. It'll take them a couple years to climb out of this hole. And so you've got that natural friction there. And we, as the operator, it burdens us to try and thread the needle and strike the right balance. And to make it more complex, as you mentioned, we've got 30 brands.
Yeah.
We've got to adjust that by quality tier as well. Somebody that's staying in a St. Regis or a Ritz-Carlton is going to be paying a very different rate and have different service expectations, as opposed to a customer that's staying on a highway Fairfield Inn. And so it's a complex riddle to navigate, to be sure.
I will say, having traveled for the last year, you are not getting the rates from me that you typically would.
That's right.
I mean, in some cases, they're a fraction of it, and they're not back yet.
No, you're right. Although in certain leisure destinations, we're ahead of where we were. I don't know if you've had a chance to visit our Ritz-Carlton Reserve, Dorado Beach in Puerto Rico. Last week, they set an all-time average rate record. So in some leisure destinations, we're right back to pre-pandemic rate levels. But broadly, your comment's dead on.
Jonathan in our audience is asking a little bit more about the numbers. Core return on investment figures for the travel industry have collapsed into single digits. If you bake in CapEx, free cash return is far lower. Can you provide some guidance on when Marriott, specifically in the travel industry generally, returns to double-digit ROI figures of the past several years?
Yeah, unfortunately, I'll give you the same answer that I gave many of the analysts during our earnings call yesterday, which is I'd love to tell you if this were a more typical recession, I would look at recovery trends from prior recessions and use that to give you predictions. This is so unpredictable. And use China. Look at the first quarter in China. All of a sudden, you saw some spikes in infection rates in January and February. We went from 60 to 30% occupancy overnight. Then those outbreaks were contained. In March, we got right back up into the 70s. And so if I could tell you with clarity what the pace of vaccination rates was going to be, if I could tell you that there was going to be a steady, even descending trend line on infections and mortality, I could answer that question with some precision. Unfortunately, I'm forced into a position where I have to say, we have to wait and see.
Daniel asks, has Marriott changed how it plans to use office space in the new headquarters being developed in Bethesda? Will fewer employees work from there? Does it need less space as a result?
Great question. We certainly can't change the space. The building is topped out and we're doing interior fit out, but I can tell you we're changing the configuration of the work floors. Our view is that our workforce will demand a hybrid work schedule. And from a technology perspective, what we envision is one of our young associates will look at his or her schedule for the next day. They'll realize they're doing all phone calls and they'll work remotely. Then Thursday, they'll look at their schedule. They've got 2 special projects they're working on. Using the app, they'll book a workstation or a space in collaboration rooms, and they'll come to the office. We've actually on the work floors taken about 30% of the workstations out and replaced those with larger collaboration rooms. And I think that's a lot, that really reflects what our work will look like in the coming years.
One of the things about your predecessors, Arnie and Bill before that, is, first of all, your company has always been very open with the media and accommodating of us, which we appreciate. But you had this sense, the person who holds your office is sort of a CEO of the world, right? You touch and see trends probably faster than most industries, right? There may be a few industries that have more people going through their doors, but it might be in a certain segment. You're across segments, across geographies, across economies. What is it that you think works best right now? And Brian, I don't know if government leaders are asking you this, but given that you've seen it in so many different places, you've seen the evolution of COVID and the recovery, is there something that you would like to tell some leaders to say, hey, why don't you try that? That really works well. Or others, hey, definitely don't do this.
I think the thing I'd like to tell them, it's probably, closing the barn door after the horse is out. I think there was a window of opportunity for a global, comprehensive and reliable set of health credentials. Whether it was the UN or the G20 or the EU or the US taking a leadership position, there was a window of opportunity to create that platform. I fear that that window has closed. I think instead we are morphing to a place where if we're not going to have that comprehensive platform, it's going to require a level of trust and a level of flexibility that candidly probably makes me a bit uncomfortable. But I'm not sure we have a choice. So the EU is going to open to vaccinated travelers. I assume what that means is the US visitor will arrive with a little handwritten CDC card. It's probably the most easily counterfeited card you could ever have. And with all due respect to the hardworking folks that work at border control in all the European countries, I'm not sure they're particularly interested in verifying the validity of that card.
Right.
So they're just going to have to trust that people are being honest. And that worries me a bit. I think there was an opportunity, but I think that opportunity's passed.
Well, Tony, I think there's an opportunity to look at this even more holistically on how we think about these things. The one thing that's been different about this pandemic from the recession in 2008 was the recession in 2008 had global leaders coordinating a global response. And that didn't feel like it happened this time around.
No, that's right. And in fact, I know your members have been reporting on this. I think increasingly, ignore travel for a minute. I think there's a lot of frustration with the Biden administration to say, look how well you've done at home. You should take a global leadership role on vaccine production, vaccine distribution. We've been working closely with the administration on the response to India. I'm privileged enough to sit on the business roundtable, and we've spent lots of time with the administration on that response, which I think is encouraging. But again, it feels a bit piecemeal. And I think that's been our big frustration in travel and tourism.
And you talk about the business roundtable. There has been a position that leaders like you have been put into in the last several months because of this voting rights stuff and the certification of the election. And the question comes up all the time. What should corporate America do? What should CEOs do? What should leaders do? Now, at Marriott, you have a strong history of sort of saying bad policies are bad business. How do you navigate this one?
It's a great question, especially for a CEO in his chair for about 80 days. The best advice I've gotten is to really focus on those issues that are most impactful to our business and our workforce. And I can give you 3 quick examples. I was one of the first CEOs to come out with a very forceful statement about stopping Asian hate. It was the right thing to do. I got hundreds and hundreds of responses from our customers, from our associates. Similarly, we came out on voting rights, less specifically critical to the Georgia lawmakers, more talking about the importance of a strong democracy how that impacts and supports our business, and why we think increasing, not decreasing, the number of voters out there is good for our democracy. At the other end of the spectrum, I had a very, very dear, close personal friend who was killed in the senseless mass shooting in Boulder. And while I came out personally on that, that probably wasn't the right position for me to take as the CEO of Marriott, but there is no right answer. I confer with our board, I confer with my colleagues around the senior leadership table, and we try to do what's right, but it is increasingly complex, made more complex when you hear some of our lawmakers publicly threaten public companies and public company CEOs and essentially telling them to shut up and dribble. And it's discouraging.
Is this difficult from a recruiting perspective? Because a lot of your young associates, I think this applies to all of us in major businesses, want CEOs and companies, want to work for companies that take political positions. I mean, the ones you mentioned, very clear cut and easy to take, but I imagine you've got associates who want stronger statements or statements on more things.
Not only associates, but guests. Increasingly, when we're booking group travel, it's no longer acceptable to them, nor should it be, for there to be a paragraph in the annual report about our commitments to sustainability. Before they will book a group meeting, they want to go through the granular detail of the company's efforts and our demonstrated track record in areas like sustainability, in areas like gender equality, in areas like race equality. And so you're exactly right. Prospective future employees, they are voting with their feet. They want to work with companies whose values match theirs and that are willing to take public positions.
One of the things Arnie talked about a lot was visas, the difficulty in getting to the United States, and the general mood that the U.S., the vibe that the U.S. was giving off in terms of immigrants and things like that. And he said that it started to have an effect on bookings, decisions to travel to the United States, decisions to hold conferences in the United States. He was vocal for the last few years with the government to say, could you just not sort of send this vibe that America hates people?
The U.S. is a fabulous destination for global travelers. Many travelers around the world have fantasized since they were children of visiting some of the wonderful destinations here in the U.S. We've lost considerable market share on the global stage for exactly the reasons that you just described. We've made it harder to enter the country. There has been dialogue on Capitol Hill that would lead international visitors to believe they're not welcome. You look at things like the senseless violence we've seen against certain minority groups here in the US. Yeah, I think we've got lots of work to do to restore the appeal of the United States as a global travel destination.
Do you have a seat at that table? I mean, Marriott has, and that is one of the good things. You've sort of taken those leadership positions. Do you have a seat at that table? Is the administration asking for your input?
Well, whether they're asking or not, we're providing it. I would say through a couple places. We're very active with the AHLA, which clearly has a voice with the administration, and with the USTA. And I sit on the CEO roundtable of the USTA. Just yesterday, we sent a group letter to the Biden administration with a series of steps that we recommend to try and spur significant growth in travel demand. So we'll continue to be quite vocal. And it's an area where we really come to the same side of the table as many of our global competitors. It's really an industry issue.
If there is another round of stimulus, and there may be, there's discussions about it, does the hospitality industry need to be involved in that? Is there something you need from the government?
I think yes. The short answer is yes. It's really the owners that need the most support. The PPP loans have been helpful for a small number of our owners, but when you look at the city center hotels, they still have a long recovery ahead of them. And I think making pools of debt available as they work their way through a lengthier recovery will be really important for the industry.
What do you take away from this crisis? you've taken over officially in February, but you were involved, and you've been involved with the company for a long time. So you've had a front seat to it right from the beginning. What's your biggest takeaway? What's different now than you a year and a half ago?
Well, if you'll indulge me, maybe two, and it won't surprise you, they're both quite optimistic. I think on the guest side, I spent a lot of I actually have a small house in Tuscany that I've not been able to visit for 2 years. So I spent the last 15 months as a voracious reader, and a lot of my reading was on ancient Roman history. And early in the pandemic, I came across this quote, and it was the Roman philosopher Seneca. And he said, "Travel and change of place impart vigor to the mind." And I wrote it down, and I stuck that scrap of paper in my wallet. And I've looked at it quite often, and it gives me enormous optimism about the future of travel. Human beings crave that personal connection. They crave that change of place. And so one of my takeaways is I am highly confident that the industry will underestimate how steep the demand curve looks like. I think 2 or 3 years from now, if I'm lucky enough to talk with you again, we'll look back and say, boy, we missed it. It came roaring back much more quickly than we ever anticipated.
I think you're right. I think the Roaring '20s analogy for travel might
I think
actually
that's
be
right.
there.
And I think that the other takeaway for me is the resilience of our associates and the resilience of our culture. I talk to our teams around the world every day, and they've been dealt a really tough hand. And the enthusiasm and the alacrity with which they take care of each other, and they take care of our customers, and they take care of the communities where we operate gives me just enormous pride about our company and our culture. And if that culture can endure something like the last 15 months, I think it bodes really well for the future of the company.
I was taken when we got news of Arnie's passing by a number of your associates with whom I was in contact, who were very, very deeply affected by this.
Mm-hmm.
They were he was a very well-regarded leader and CEO. How did you manage that situation with morale at the company?
Well, let me start by saying I'd be lying if I didn't say I was still reeling from his passing. I know, Ali, you knew him, and even when he was diagnosed, sadly, in today's world, we all become amateur doctors, right? We go to Google, we look at the statistics, but he was such a youthful 60-year-old, fit, man of faith, strong family support structure, strong professional support structure, access to the best medical care in the world. I think many of us dismissed the statistics and assumed he was the one that would beat the odds. So it has been a devastatingly sad set of circumstances, obviously for his family, but for the Marriott family, for I think the business world more broadly. The thing that's been remarkable to me when I read all of these beautiful tributes, so few talk about business. They really talk about his kindness and his character and his ability to connect with folks at every level of the organization in every corner of the world. It's been difficult. I think the transparency with which he went through his treatment helped our associates around the world deal with the news of his unexpected passing. But I think we've leaned on our culture. I think we've put our arms around each other. As I've talked to thousands of associates around the world, what I've said to them, and you'll appreciate this knowing him so well, I said, knowing that Nordic stoicism, if I was lucky enough to speak to him, what he would say is, wipe those silly tears away, dust yourself off. There's thousands and thousands of people relying on you. Get back to work. And so we've tried to compartmentalize those emotions, but it's been terribly difficult.
Your company has been good at keeping those family values in there. So our thoughts to your colleagues and your staff, and thanks, Tony, for being so frank with us today.
It's my absolute pleasure. And again, thank you so much for the conversation. It's been so interesting to me, as you might expect. In my first 80 or 90 days, I've done lots of media interviews. And your colleagues around the world, they're so anxious for great news about travel. I don't get that many tough questions. They want good news. They
Yeah.
want us to all get on the road. So I really appreciate all the support.
When all gets back to normal, we'll give you some tough questions.
Look forward to it.
We can promise you that. And we really want to thank you, Tony Capuano, the CEO of Marriott International, and the whole Marriott family for helping make this possible. Big thanks to you, Ali Velshi, anchor at MSNBC, good friend to Sabu. Great conversation. And folks, there's more ahead today, so don't go away. Actually, go get a lemonade or a refreshment. At 4 o'clock, we got networking for early journalists coming up. We got networking for freelancers at 4 o'clock. And then we have a huge trivia game contest at 4 o'clock. Then at 5 o'clock, the Sabu Best in Business Awards, where we award the best business journalists for their work in 2020. And there was a lot of good work out there. But again, thanks to you, Tony, and thanks to you, Ali, and we'll see you all a little bit later.
Thank you all.